as you can see here, which are their social value, their aesthetic. Aesthetic is important because we are still talking about landscapes. And of course, the ecological value, because they have the landscape is inhabited by vegetation and fauna. So these are, I believe, the three values that need to be reconsidered in order to acquire a new conscience and to give value really to these kind of landscapes in the city. And in order to do that, we will briefly look at today we will ask ourselves three main questions. The first one being, what are these residual landscapes in the city? The second one, how do residual landscapes come to be? How are they generated in the specific case in Tirana? And the third one is, what could these landscapes be in the future? How could they contribute to the ecological and social future of cities? The first question is, what are residual landscapes? I will skim very quickly through this because this is a very theoretical research into what are these landscapes, these residual landscapes. And of course, they haven't always existed, probably. And the fact that when they did not exist, there were no words to define them. It wasn't until the first half of the 20th century, with the urban explosion and all the changes taking place in major cities, and most of all, with very interesting new ways to express art in photography and performing arts and painting, and that all these spaces started attracting the attention of artists first, and then also later of architects, planners, and social scientists. And once they started becoming interesting, new words started coming out to describe them. And these are just a few of these words that were used in history to define such spaces. Of course, in order to ask ourselves what these landscapes are and what their meaning is, we need to look at the three main filters through which I always analyze things, which are, of course, their social and cultural value. So we need to see, of course, throughout history, but in different societies, what their social and cultural value is, what their aesthetic value, again, because we're talking about landscape, and what their ecological value and potential is. Starting from the first one, their social and cultural value, the most important aspects of them is that they, in fact, constitute a spatial alternative. They're an alternative to the planned and organized spaces in the city, but they're also open for new things to happen. And therefore, they constitute an opportunity. This is, well, the fact that they are an alternative is this typical condition where when we have two opposing conditions and situations, like private, public, here and there, natural and artificial, man has always felt the need to find a third intermediate condition. As for these landscapes, they're either productive or non-productive, and then there's always the in-between. And in terms of the fact that they constitute an opportunity, this was very well explained by Ignacio de Solá-Morales in the 1960s, where he started his research on these spaces, starting from the eye of an urban photographer. So taking pictures of these things and talking about their potential, these abandoned spaces. And the important thing is that you use the French word to define them. He chose a French word which is vague, and he called them terrain vague, because of the triple signification that is contained within the single word in French. It has two Latin roots and one German root. And between the two Latin roots, the first one is vacus, which means vacant or void, and vagus, which means indeterminate. The German root vague means unstable. And from this triple signification, we find actually what the potential of these areas is. So the first Latin meaning, which is vacant and void, allows us to believe that they can become containers of opportunity. From the second Latin root, which means indeterminate and imprecise and ambiguous, we have the possibility of permeability, of the possibility to access these sites. And from the German origin root of the word, which means unstable, vague, we have the fact that these landscapes are always and ever evolving, and therefore also constitute an opportunity, as we were saying before. So in terms, this is the social and cultural value of these landscapes was what we just talked about. Now we will talk briefly about the aesthetic value of these landscapes. And this needs to deal, of course, when we're talking about aesthetics, we have to discuss the cultural conception of nature, because that's what one of the primary elements of a landscape. The utilitarian character of landscape and the ecological character. So these two factors are also contributing, can contribute to give an aesthetic value to a specific landscape. So in terms of cultural conception of nature, so as we will see, as I know, as I've studied, the aesthetic value is always, in terms of landscape, can be related to the cultural conceptions that people have had throughout history about nature, where there is this tendency to always compare or make comparisons or relate landscapes to the pristine lands. So there is a condition where nature is totally wild and not managed by man, and all the other kinds of landscapes are a result of something that used to be natural and then was modified. And this leads to, again, tripartitions. I mean, one of the most famous one is by John Dixon Hunt, where he was making a classification of natural landscape, with the first nature being the pristine, untouched forest, the second one being the one that is engineered by man, like agriculture, but for productive purposes. And he was proposing this third nature, which was actually an art. It had to do with aesthetics, because it was the art of garden design. And more recent theories, like the one by Gilles Clément, where the third landscape in this case is actually what we are talking about today, all the unmanaged landscapes, and in the specific, the ones that were that previously were managed by men. And so in the aesthetic value, what can give an aesthetic value to these landscapes is, of course, in first place is probably art and performing and visual arts, because, when photography started depicting this kind of landscapes, they started acquiring also attention, but also acquiring an aesthetic appeal. But of course, there is the... when we talk about aesthetics, we need to deal with the dual aspect of landscape, which is the represented, as we saw, landscape, but also the actual lived space, which has to do also with landscape architecture practice. In terms of, let's say, landscape architecture as the built and lived space, there are recently a lot of practices in landscape architecture that are dealing in the specific with there's this acquisition of a new ruderal aesthetic in their projects, as if they were becoming more and more familiar with. And within these approaches, there are, I believe, this is my consideration, 3 different approaches within this general interest in the ruderal aesthetics. One of them is the integration, is when we integrate this ruderal vegetation in a rehabilitation, for example, project of an industrial facility. There is the second one, which is guidance. It's actually, in this case, what we are doing is we are reinstating spontaneous evolution of plants. So we are actually artificially reinstating that kind of condition in an artificialized landscape. This is an example. It's the regeneration of a river area in Geneva. By the Combe is the office. And of course, the most interesting approach is the one where we're actually artificially recreating an aesthetic aspect of spontaneous vegetation. And of course, the most famous example is the High Line, and it's not by a chance. In fact, in this case, it's the very pictures that were taken of the abandoned industrial infrastructure, the railway, with the overgrown wild vegetation. Actually, these pictures inspired the approach that was, we don't have a picture of the High Line today here, but it's actually what inspired, this is one part. This ruderal appearance of the vegetation inspired the project that was designed later, which recreated aesthetic aspects of spontaneous vegetation within the project. Now, the third aspect that we'll discuss before talking briefly before talking about Tirana in the specific is the ecological value. There is no need to say what, like other landscapes, how much they can be valuable for the urban environment, first and foremost because these landscapes still provide ecosystem services. And for those of you who don't know, these are the benefits that are provided by natural and ecological processes. So what plants, soil, water, fauna, so animals and birds, all these are the benefits that are for our well-being inside the city that are provided by also by landscapes. And this is just a diagram that is showing what usually happens in the evolution of these residual landscapes. So we have from a pristine nature, and so a landscape that is untouched by man. At some point, man started, oh, you can't really see this, but there is a city designed here. So people start managing the landscape, and what they do is they reduce very much the biodiversity, which used to be high and with a stable ecosystem in the wilderness. Then, of course, if we abandon these landscapes, we will generate these residual landscapes that are, again, have a more, there is an increase again of the biodiversity, but it's a very heterogeneous, very different mix. So at this point, we have a choice. We can either start managing these landscapes in the traditional way with the productive logics of the city and reduce their biodiversity again. But if we actually left them evolve spontaneously, they would probably evolve into woodlands with a very high level of biodiversity, which contributes to the health of the urban ecosystem and continue to produce, as we saw before, ecosystem services. So to conclude this section, what we are saying is that generally how not just we, but theorists and people that have discussed this kind of landscapes, they're always classifying or judging them and evaluating them based on the level of human intervention, of human maintenance. The presence or not of the latter is what determines if there are residual landscapes. So how do residual landscapes come to be? And this is where I did the research at Polis University, which was about trying to understand the dynamics that generate these landscapes in Tirana and try to understand what their potential is. So in Tirana, these landscapes are very common, especially in the center of the city, and they're always constantly evolving, and actually they're incrementally fragmented because things change so fast inside the city. So what are the mechanisms that generate them? Just to summarize very briefly, of course, it's of course the the socio-physical dynamics that contribute to the generation of these landscapes are very significant changes that happen in Tirana in the last 50, 60 years. The migration trends inside to the city, for example, as we will see, this is, for example, one of the processes that generated them, these suspended landscapes, which is the property disputes. When land is suspended, there is no clear idea of what is going to happen for legal issues probably, and so the vegetation starts developing and freely. There are other conditions that generate them, like for example the very long process of demolition that happened not long ago and it's still taking place in some areas where we have landscapes of trauma. So when there's a demolition and the area is left over. But of course there is another interesting, let's say, dynamic that generates them, which is the explosion of individuality and the cultural rejection of programmed communal space after the socialist dictatorship, which kind of generated this refusal of organized space. And this is a very common thing that you could see until a few years. Now, this year it's less, of course, but when we were doing the research, all these communal areas between the communist blocks were generally abandoned, and that's where we became residual landscapes. So how do we observe this evolution? We did this at the micro and micro scale. This means on the larger picture of the city and, of course, going in depth into the single cases. At the macro scale, we analyzed the city inside the ring. So and the way this was done was through the identification of these spaces within the city and their mapping and classification and an in-depth analysis. So the way they were identified is, of course, they had to be areas that were previously managed and then were abandoned. And, of course, there had to be vegetation. So, you can't see the line work. This is a great map of the big map of Tirana in the area that was surveyed. And there is an account of all these spaces that were mapped, and they were put on a GIS file so that we could add information in layers. And these landscapes were also classified. So because of the way you identify is that they were previously used, and what the use they had before actually influences the kind of vegetation that develops there and their morphology also sometimes. So the way they were classified is based on their prior use. And so you can come across trauma lands, so they're like abandoned war objects, just to show a few examples. Or another typology is debris land, they're abandoned, demolished building sites, or abandoned industrial facilities, abandoned tunnels, abandoned infrastructures, not just roads, but also other kinds of infrastructure. And of course, abandoned public space, which is very common in Tirana. And so the general results about this research were, of course, that out of all the surface that was surveyed, a very important thing was that 2% of the surveyed area was made of these residual landscapes. But the other great potential is that the surface constitute 1/3 of the actually officially green and blue infrastructure of the city. So we have a potential to add 1/3 of green into the city because we have this big surface that is still abandoned and residual. Another thing that was noticed that, of course, there is no specific relationship between the fact, because they were both private and public spaces, they were equally numbered, let's say. And another interesting thing is, of course, that then we went down in depth and we analyzed each one of these sites singularly, recording all the information about their morphology, materiality, and context. And all this information, of course, we're not going to look at everything, but I can show you just one of the first sites that was analyzed, which is called Site 0. And it was observed over the course of almost 4 years, trying to appreciate the spatial, ecological, and social qualities of this space. So the specific site is a site that was, of course, changing, ever-changing according to the different seasons, but also from year to year because of human intervention. So there were people going there to collect wild spices or to bring their cattle to graze, but there were also people that were maintaining it every once in a while because it was getting too wild and cutting the grass. And of course, the most interesting thing is the relationship, the attitude of people towards these abandoned landscapes, because it's like what they're operating is like a mediation. It's there are no big conflicts about these spaces. The people tend to coexist peacefully with these spaces. So what is so this engagement of people with these landscapes is through individual tactics, so spontaneous tactics of informal appropriation, which are silently negotiated with the community and the owners. So there's some kind of balance. So the last part has to do with what is their potential then? What can these residual landscapes in Tirana be in the future? And whilst in other countries, especially of the Western world, there is this negative feel about these abandoned spaces, and they have often become refuge for illegal activities or temporary shelter for the homeless, in Tirana there is a slightly different attitude, and they're not seen under a negative light. In fact, these spaces constitute a very important, they are a very important asset to the city itself. So why the observation of these solutions while in Tirana what they're offering is a mix of order and anarchy, a new level of order that can contribute to a new understanding of contemporary urban processes and contribute to the resilience of the urban ecosystem. So other countries could learn from the attitude that they have in Tirana. So to conclude, what we are summarizing are the 3 points that we highlighted in the beginning, is that they are places for social interaction. In fact, what they're offering is they're responding to the direct needs of the citizens. They're places of contemplation because of this new rural aesthetics that are becoming common. And they're a refuge for biodiversity, and therefore they keep providing ecosystem services. Every